While at the time of recording, Susan was Chief of Strategy and Capital Development for the private investment activities at Two Sigma. She is now Head of Capital Formation and Business Development at GrowthCurve Capital. This podcast is brought to you with the kind support of Plutus Capital, a female-run investment management firm based in Evanston, Illinois, which works with clients on a wide variety of mandates such as custom diversity solutions, manager due diligence, diversified hedge fund to fund allocations, and advisory services.
One of the things that I've seen and I really believe in is the AQ, or the adaptability quotient. That is actually really critical.
Our next guest stresses the importance of adaptability and shares her insight as an Asian American in finance who strives to be a mouthpiece for many. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Susan So, who is Chief of Strategy and Capital Development for the private investment activities at Two Sigma, a $60 billion financial sciences firm with businesses in investment management, insurance, private equity, and venture capital. She was previously a founding partner and global head of marketing and client services at Perella Weinberg Partners, and prior to that held a series of roles in business development at a series of hedge funds and private equity firms. She originally trained as a lawyer and an M&A banker. She is a board member of AAAIM, which is held since 2014. AAIM is the Association of Asian American Investment Managers. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Aoife.
So let's start with talking a bit about your journey into the investment world, maybe starting with where you grew up and what you studied.
Oh, sure. So I'm actually born and raised in New Jersey. So South Jersey originally, Freehold, where Bruce Springsteen is from. So some people have heard of that town called Freehold. But I actually grew up in Bergen County, up in Mahwah. It's interesting, as I was thinking about this, there was like no Asians back then. Of course, there's a lot of Asians now. But when I went to high school, there was like two other Asians in my class, and that was it, right? And so, of course, folks were like, oh, so you guys can all hang out together because you're the only Asians here. But it was a great place to grow up. My parents actually immigrated here, like many Chinese parents or Asian parents. They came here for graduate school. My dad actually went to graduate school in Kansas, and he was a truck driver. He was a cook. He was a research chemist. He tells us all the time that he had multiple jobs, which he used to pay for school. And so, of course, teaching us the same, sort of mentality. When he left or graduated, he actually went to Rockefeller University to work in a lab. And I'm telling you this because it will tell you a little bit about sort of the environment I grew up in. In Asia, when my parents were growing up, medicine and science, and even today, is very highly regarded and therefore highly compensated. When he came here, he realized that's not always the case. And he also learned from his own experience that, and unfortunately this was, in the 60s, if you didn't go to an Ivy League and you were a foreigner and you didn't fit in, you wouldn't be respected. It was going to be really difficult. So my dad decided pretty early on that he had to change careers. Otherwise, there's no way he would send his kids to Ivy League schools, which was an imperative given what he had learned. And so he did what you may have seen a lot of other Asian families did. He gave up his career as a research chemist and became an entrepreneur and owned a couple of dry cleaning stores and video stores and computer stores. And so, of course, both my brother and I actually ended up working there in high school. We learned the value of the customer is always right, and client service actually helps me to this very day. But it was a very typical Chinese family where education was the most important thing. You had to get straight A's and you had to go to an Ivy League. That was the imperative. And everything was perfectly planned out, actually. And interestingly, there's also it's sort of a part of our culture. In the Chinese culture, they have what's called suan ming, which means literally calculating your life or calculating your destiny. And so when I was born, my grandfather on my father's side hired someone to do this. And so they had said, your granddaughter is going to be a lawyer, maybe a senator. And so that's the path. So of course, that was the planned path that my parents had for me, was that I needed to become a lawyer or a business lawyer. And there was no deviation from that, actually. And so it actually leads to sort of what I've done now, because now it was like, okay, it has to be practical. Here's the path. I don't know if you know many other folks who sort of grew up around the time we did here, but your choices were either you go to law school, you go to, med school, you become an engineer, maybe business, but maybe not. And you had to go to grad school. And so those were the choices. And so for me, obviously, business and law was what I ended up doing. And that's actually how I ultimately got to sort of this roundabout path of what I do today. Took a lot in econ and ended up going to law school. And, the rest is history as to how I ended up. I'll tell you later, but it was a really interesting path to get there.
It is, but it's not that atypical, actually, because I know a lot of lawyers, we may call them recovering lawyers, who are now in the world of investment. And actually, it was my time working in corporate law which really enticed me into the financial world. How did your journey happen from work? Did you actually spend time working as a lawyer?
I did. I hated it. I would love to ask you if you liked your time. I loved law school because I went to Harvard for law school. I was up in Boston. And Boston is just such a great place for graduate school. I don't know if I would have thrived if I'd been there as an undergrad, because I would have been candidly too distracted to want to take advantage of everything that Boston has. But at the law school, you could take classes at the business school, the Kennedy School of Public Policy. You could do clinics. So I did all of that and I loved it. And then I started working at Cravath and I realized, all those great summers where they spent courting you, working on these great assignments, it's not like that at all, right? Now you are basically more like a high-paid paralegal or legal secretary. You're stuck in a data room combing through papers. Cravath in particular has a structure where you are assigned to the same partner for 2 years. And I was assigned with one of the best partners there, but he was definitely one of the most, I would say, he'd been there for quite some time, so quite set in his ways of how you need to practice and how you learn. And it also happened to be, senior securities offerings, which was just not something I was interested in. So after not even a year, I really started to question what I had done. Interestingly, the reason I chose corporate law, even though I mentioned you earlier, my parents were like, you have to be a business lawyer. My summers, though, to get to law school, I spent at like the, U.S. Attorney's Office when Rudy Giuliani was there. At Yale, I worked at the Connecticut State Prosecutor's Office. I actually really liked that part of the work and the pro bono work that I did at Harvard, because you could do clinics. But when I actually started practicing corporate law, which is the exact opposite, but that's because, the practical side of me was like, no, you got to make money. You can't actually go on the pro bono side. I really didn't like it at all. But the good thing was, because I had majored in econ and a lot of my classmates at Harvard had been in finance, I'd always kept in touch with them and was always curious about what that particular career would be. And so one of the things I did was I actually took a class at NYU Stern School of Business at night while I was, supposed to be in the data room doing all my work, and I loved it. I actually realized if I love this class that's by Brearley and Myers, Principal of Finance, versus what I'm supposed to be doing in the office, clearly I'm in the wrong field. And so that's how I knew I had to switch. And this was in the 90s. So candidly, it was relatively easy to switch because a lot of the banks were looking for talent and they were willing to look at lawyers or consultants. Obviously, you needed to learn. And so it was a big, heavy lift, but I loved it. I loved the Excel modeling. I didn't know anything about that when I first joined. But I also made the decision not only to switch to banking to M&A, which was the exact, very, very different than law. I also wanted to make sure that it wasn't the culture that was something I didn't like. Cravath is a fantastic firm, extremely structured though. And I went to Bear Stearns, which, as many of you may know, although it doesn't exist anymore, very unstructured, extreme meritocracy, eat what you kill, highly entrepreneurial. And so I thought, you know what? Let's try the exact opposite of Cravath. And I'm going to go to Bear and I'm going to do M&A. And I loved it. I never looked back after that. Many times, law firms would call again saying, would you mind, coming back? I actually speak Chinese fluently. So that was also a time when they were looking for people who could speak Mandarin and were willing to practice and go to Asia. At one point, I thought I was going to go to Asia. I didn't, just couldn't do that. It was like, I can't do law. Maybe it'll be helpful in what I do in banking or some other future career, but there's no way I would actually go back to being a lawyer. So my parents nearly fainted the second I told them I was leaving law. So they weren't happy with that.
It certainly was a deviation from the plan. But similar to you, I actually absolutely love the Excel modeling. And I remember I actually got my first offer was from Lehman. I did have to do an MBA after my law degree, but the feeling of just being so utterly grateful that I was going to be given this place on an associate program, which would have involved quite a lot of work and those late nights you mentioned, it was just all new. And the fact that they were willing to train me and get me involved in all these numbers was so exciting. So I totally understand that.
No, totally. Absolutely. In fact, I remember when I wanted to make the switch, I said, I was already a second year associate, when I decided to make the switch. And I specifically asked to be a first year in the training program because I wanted to go through that and I wanted to learn it. And I was just like you, I loved what I was doing, what I was learning. And like I said earlier, it was literally vertical, the learning, but it was so great to learn something different and to have the opportunity to do that.
And moving from there, you moved into which I think arguably is some of the most challenging aspect of financial services, which is building businesses and growing an institutional investor base. After many years of cycling through hedge funds and private equity firms, what do you believe are keys to success in that area?
So I've had a lot of aha moments in that, as I've been going through things. But the one thing that I will say, looking back, that has always been important. And again, no size fits all, right? There's lots of different firms. There's small firms, there's big firms, there's multi-asset management firms in the alternative space. I do think, though, personally, you need to be nimble and opportunistic, but you need to be client-oriented, right? A lot of businesses focus only on returns. And I see that, I talked to a lot of portfolio managers and their, marketing or client service is a cost center. They report into the operations team. And unfortunately, even in today, many portfolio managers view clients as sort of a necessary evil. I think that is a horrible way to think about it. Businesses that place clients first, right, and have a service mind are always going to do better. Who doesn't want to invest with good people who think of you as a partner? You don't worry what's going to happen when things go the other way, that they're not going to treat you fairly, right? And I think that's important. And so regardless of where you are in the environment or what type of business it is, I do think a client-focused firm, of course, return-oriented, that's what's going to be more powerful and more sustainable, which is what you want, right? Ultimately, you want a business that can last for the long term. But I also think it's important to know the trends. No one has a crystal ball. You can't really forecast what's going to happen, but you certainly can stay close to what's going on in your industry and globally to know that, for instance, the last few years, you need to be focused on innovation. And you also need to be focused on your talent, right? If your talent is the younger talent pool that we all know now, and used to be the millennials, and now it's like, my son's generation, they're highly creative. They're so advanced when it comes to technology, but they also don't want to work 100-hour work weeks and be in an office, right? They're the ones who are going to shape the future. If you want to build a business that's going to be around for a while, you need to understand and appreciate where they're coming from and build a business sort of around that trend, or, sort of this, it's not necessarily a trend because I think it's here to stay. But I do think that firms that take into account all of this, as opposed to staying only focused on their strategy. And a lot of firms do that, right? Long short equity, I'm just going to focus on generating great returns and the strategy. I'm not going to think about what other people do. Unfortunately, over time, you're probably going to lose some market share if you're not really thinking about what's happening next to you. Those who are a little bit more strategic and more thoughtful and pay a little bit more attention out there will end up doing better. That's just me, though.
It's a very interesting point. I also think, as we look to kind of growing the teams of the future, these millennials, as you mentioned, they have had a particularly, I think, probably particularly severe setback with COVID disruptions in terms of experiences they've missed out on. So I think perhaps tuning into that will also be key to ensuring that they stay. Just moving on to, in terms of given building a business is not without setbacks and challenges. You said you've learned quite a bit over the years. With any particular lessons that you've learned that you can share now?
Absolutely. Certainly I've had a career path that's pretty twisted, and convoluted. Some people, it's interesting. A lot of folks will look at my career path because, lawyer, then banker, then private equity, then hedge funds, then multi-asset management, and a little bit of VC. And if you look at where I am today, I've had some folks say to me, so you planned all that, right? And I'm like, absolutely not. I mean, it's been all over the place, right? And I would say that every experience I've had has been really impactful in getting me, obviously, to where I am today. And I actually use all of that. But some of the setbacks and challenges, I would say for me personally, as opposed to sort of the, setbacks and challenges our businesses face, which is only a whole new conversation we could talk about. But, I definitely, if I look at when I was younger versus now, when I first started, I did not have a thick skin. It doesn't mean I really have a thick skin, but, you get a little edgier when you get older, right? And I took things more personally when I was younger. Now I don't take things personally. I try to figure out where the other person is coming from. I remember when I first started, and Ethan, I don't know if you were ever told this, but I definitely did when I first interviewed at Yale for jobs before I decided I was going to go to law school. I was told many times, you're too nice, you won't survive in banking. And I actually didn't like that, right? Like, what do you mean I'm too nice, right? So that was sort of like a backhanded, compliment earlier on. And I've always been raised this way. Constructive criticism should be, you should take that. It's great to get it. It's just hard to hear, right? And you want to take it to heart. But for me, a lot of the setbacks and challenges I used as a learning experience to pivot. Like a lot of people sort of will take it and they can't I see a little bit of this in my son, like he gets a setback and he sort of just starts spinning and spinning and spinning. He gets in a corner. One of the things that I've learned is you just can't, you got to take it and see what you can do with it and turn it around. I've always been an optimistic person. This was something I learned from my mom. I'm definitely more of a glasses half full, not a half empty person. Take it, figure out what that silver lining is, and then use it, right? Maybe that setback was a blessing in disguise. I tend to think it, for me, that's how I've thought about it. And then see how you can use it in whatever your next phase is going to be, or if the business is at a challenge or inflection point, how do you use that to your advantage to, move things forward? I will say one thing that many of us heard when we were growing up is, IQ and the importance of EQ, right? And all those, 7 habits for successful people. And, they kept talking about that, emotional intelligence. One of the things that I've seen and I really believe in is the AQ, or the adaptability quotient. That is actually really critical. And that's one thing I know I didn't have when I was younger, because as we mentioned earlier, I had a set path and I had to stick to it. So adaptability was definitely not on, wasn't really there. It was only as I got older and realized that these were really opportunities for me and that you should learn to be adaptable, that I now, it's a big core of who I am and how I approach things. And I also really think, for like my children, like I tell them, guys, you can't be so inflexible. You have to learn to be adaptable if you're going to succeed. That AQ is critical.
That is a wonderful concept. I love it. I'm definitely going to borrow it. But I wonder whether working in markets and in a business development role kind of forces that on you as well, which is, I'm sure, how you've grown. Because first of all, markets are unforgiving and volatile. And then you, with your client interface, you have to adapt and come clean, I suppose, and be transparent. So certainly it forces it on you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably right. Again, hindsight is 20/20, so I would say yes, right? But back then, I don't know that I would have. I would say in alternatives, right? The alternatives asset classes forces you to be nimble if you're going to succeed, right? And I certainly also moved from asset class to asset class. Sometimes I actually wondered if I might have been better just staying in PE. I have a lot of friends who just focused on one sector. I've always thought of alternatives more broadly, but it's possible I might have done better if I stayed straight in PE as opposed to coming over to the hedge fund side. But the one thing is I've always loved learning. I'm always very curious. And so I think I would have been bored just staying in PE. And that it's that piece of not wanting to be bored that also allows me in a way to push myself to be a little bit more looking for other things, and therefore realizing you've got to be adaptable then, right? Or more flexible if you're going to take advantage of that stuff. So
And speaking of the industry adapting, so over the course of your career, what changes have you seen in the industry? And maybe if we can use this question to speak a little bit about the diversity of the industry, how has it changed over the few decades or so that you've been working in it?
oh my gosh. So that is a loaded question there because there's so many ways to talk about that. Actually, I was thinking about this. There's certainly a lot of changes. When you and I first started out, we were all expected to pull all-nighters, right, and grind in banking, right? I mean, as an analyst or associate, whether it was investment banking, consulting, law, whatever, you had to do that. And I would say certainly now, as I alluded to, with all the innovation we've been seeing, venture becoming, such a big part of things, YouTube, digital mediums, everything Silicon Valley, Bitcoin, NFTs, you name it. A lot of folks are now choosing lifestyle and creativity as sort of their path, and very successful, right? I mean, my youngest son tells me he wants to be a YouTuber because YouTubers make $16 billion right now and he doesn't need to go to college, right? And so obviously I don't want to discourage him if he thinks he could conquer the world, but that is really different than, what I was accustomed to when I first started out. And you have the recent surveys these days, Goldman, other bankers, where analysts are complaining that they're working these long hours. The reality is they sound like the same hours you and I worked back then. I think the difference is in COVID, it's been impossible to do that without having that social outlet. At least when we were, working those ridiculous hours, you were in the office, right? And you had this camaraderie with other people at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning. By the way, I'm not suggesting that's the way you need to live, but that was sort of, that was the environment you sort of learned it. I think it's great if that changes because I do think that that's not a sustainable model. You've also certainly seen changes in investment strategy. As I mentioned earlier, I think about alternatives all across the spectrum. So we've just talked about VC, Bitcoin, private credit didn't used to exist, infrastructure in private markets. You've got this huge convergence of both hedge funds and private equity and crossover funds. Everything's more global. So you're seeing those things. All of this actually goes to, in a way, your question about diversity. Like if you're going to be successful and you have this now diverse offering of things, you would hope therefore that the diversity in the industry is also changing, right, and expanding, because ultimately the diversity of thought, in my opinion, is critical and is what will be able to sort of continue to drive all of this. And the reality is, unfortunately, it's, hasn't changed much. I mean, yes, when I first started in the industry, there weren't as many Asians or women. And in fact, I remember when I got hired at Cravath, one of the folks told me, yes, you are, you're a double whammy because you're Asian and you're a woman. So we, kill two birds with one stone. But over time, interestingly, Asians are no longer considered diversity, aside from the environment today. But there were many years ago where, because of the model minority myth that we've been talking about, people saying, Asians don't count as emerging managers or diversity. When you look at diversity requirements for boards, it's Latina, African American, women, etc., but never Asian. And so that's interesting to see a little bit of that shift. Unfortunately, with all the racial tensions that we're seeing and all the anti-Asian hate crimes, all the hate crimes that have been happening, it's coming to the forefront. But this is stuff that's been around for a long time. And it's a shame that we've needed these incidents for people to realize that diversity or DEI is really critical and that it's a broad problem. I'm hoping we can do a lot more. That's part of the reason I've been so involved with AIM, which is the Association of Asian American Investment Managers. When I first joined in 2014, I think we've all acknowledged individually that there were some issues and that there wasn't enough representation. But for us, initially, it was much more of a networking and connecting Asian American managers or Asian American investment professionals with others, just because, also having a powerful support framework is really critical. And then also connecting managers to large emerging manager allocations, sometimes we qualified. Oftentimes, as I mentioned, we didn't necessarily, but just getting exposure to your large public plans was also something that a lot of folks didn't have. And so that was part of our initiative. But over time, our challenges and sort of our focus actually have been on how do we show the underrepresentation of Asian American managers in the industry, because we do see it and we believe it, but we can't prove it. And so one of the things that we've been spending much more time over the last year and change have been, in fact, on working with groups like Bella Research or Harvard Business School or others. And we actually discovered that, for instance, Asian American investment managers in the alternative space hold less than 0.7% total AUM of the entire alternative space. That's tiny, tiny. And by the way, if you look at the returns, the average returns for these Asian American owned managers is actually above average. So there isn't this, if I invest with an Asian manager, that's a concessionary investment, right? There's not that at all. But it's also partially this whole issue where a lot of people believe, well, Asians do well. You've got, senior leadership, Asian senior leadership at KKR and Carlyle. You guys are everywhere. But the reality is Asians generally also across the entire US population, there's a huge divergence, right? We definitely have many Asians who've done well, have been blessed to be able to go to Ivy League schools and chose finance and have been able to rise up to a certain level. There's still a bamboo ceiling, just like as for women, there is clearly a glass ceiling that we see, and you can't get through it. That's part of the reason why Asians end up leaving firms to start their own business, because they just can't get above a certain level. But then there are many Asian American communities that are in poverty. And as a whole, the representation number is really terrible. So that is something that I've been very focused on. It's very important to me. And this environment has obviously brought everything to the forefront. I'm actually so grateful to be a part of the board. We've got a fantastic board. And so hope that we can actually continue to fight the good fight, and we always say stronger together. But I also, by the way, as a, Asian American woman, focusing on getting greater representation of women, I think is really important, right? We've had, I'm sure we all remember this, but there's a lot of folks who went onto the mommy track and were never able to come back. There were attempts to create returnship programs because senior women left and then couldn't come back. So here's another way to do it. But the numbers are still lacking. I think I saw some study recently, I can't remember if it was in Preqin or KPMG, and basically, it's less than 20% is actually held by women. At the senior levels, super senior levels, it's tiny. And so we also really need to fix that and make sure that we have a lot more women who stay in the business and also help one another and help sort of on the recruitment side, because that's always the issue. But it's a little bit of everything, right? It's the retention and the recruitment that are also all lacking. I think it's fantastic that there are now focus on DEI and ESG, largely because investors now care, and that's a good thing. Certain government, certain states are mandating that public boards have a certain number of diversity on that. I think that's great too, but I still think it's quite early. And there's a lot more that all of us personally need to be doing, especially the more senior you are, the more you've been in the industry. You really, for me at least, that's something I want to continue to work on and make sure that I have impact there.
That is actually a very powerful point. And it really accords with something that Rod June said in his podcast in Series 1. You mentioned that many Asian Americans have done very well and that may be a perception. But I think there's so much more to this than simply diversity. I think the point of inclusion is there. And I think we saw this with the awful, with awareness of Asian American hate crimes that we saw recently in the US, that there isn't always the inclusion in society that we would wish for. And Rod actually in his podcast did give almost a prescription as to how to be more inclusive. I'm sure that's something that you're seeing at AIM as well, has been part of the battle, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and you're right. Look, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of people are just focusing on the D right now. The equity and the inclusion is also important, if not more important, for sure.
So important. But let's go back to your personal story now. You've had clearly quite a varied career. Have there been any key people in that have really influenced you, and in what way?
Oh, so many people. No, and I'm serious about that. Like every time, or anytime I meet someone, I try to learn something and take that away. So I would say candidly, everyone I've met has helped me in some way. But if I were to be specific, for sure my parents, I talked a little bit about my dad earlier. He was always sacrificing for us. He made sure we knew that. And so we had to make him proud. They came here, they were they were part of the majority when they were in Taiwan, and they came here and they became the minority. And so he always stressed to us that you have to be better. You're not white, you have to be better, but don't forget your Chinese culture either. So my first language was Chinese, but then they insisted our English be perfect, really hard to do when your parents don't speak English. But they, one of the things they made me do, which I vowed I would never do as a parent, was go to Chinese school on Sundays. So I always had more homework than all my friends. And I do the same thing now with my kids. I make them go to Chinese school on Sundays, and it's a good thing. They learn their culture, but they learn to speak Mandarin fluently. I hated it growing up, but I actually appreciate a lot of the things that our parents, had us do. We had friends whose parents went the other route, which was to assimilate, right? And it's interesting because they've confided in me at times, I wish my parents had actually pushed me to learn Chinese. I would say when I was growing up that was something that was hard to balance, wanting to be a part of the majority, but also realizing that you're pretty different. But that's the environment we grew up in. I would say now I obviously relish the fact that I'm Asian and I'm American, right? And the reality is that is a very, very much core of what I am. The other thing though was my mom taught me the importance of being independent and being able to stand on my own. I tell my niece this, she's the only girl of her generation, which is you're going to need to be independent. You have to be able to provide for yourself. Don't rely on anyone else. Obviously, you need to have a support, but don't rely on just your husband or your partner, whoever that is. Learn to be financially independent. Every single woman needs to be able to do that. And I really believe that. So those are two things. I would say career-wise, I definitely had so many folks, mentors, and even sponsors who were so helpful to me. Even just like the M&A bankers I met early on who told me, if you want balance in a family, don't stay being an M&A banker, right? Because you're going to, be working all the time and you might love it, but there might be something else you love as much that if you wanted that balance, you should consider. And that's actually what prompted me to move over to the private equity space and to think about the buy side. When I was at Lightyear, my boss, Bruce Rugen, was fantastic. It was really interesting. One moment I remember this, it was an assignment I was working with him on. I was sort of the interim GC on a lot of things at that point in time as well. And we were right in the documents. I was negotiating with somebody and he was clearly wrong. And, so I tended to be more black and white in my earlier days. And we were arguing over, some particular concept and I couldn't get him to yes at all. And so I went to Bruce and I said, we're right. We're so right. And this guy just won't give in, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, what are we talking about here? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm right. This is what we're talking about. He's like, no. How much money are we talking about here, right? And so I never thought about that. He's like, okay, how much money does he, and it was really more about a contract we were trying to sign up, right? And he's like, Susan, this contract is worth several millions of dollars. So how much are we talking about here? And I realized, oh my gosh, we're only arguing over $50,000 for a $5 or whatever $10 million contract, right? And so it was the first time where I realized, oh my gosh, sometimes you can't be so black and white. And even if you're right, you're going to be wrong if you insist that you're right and you stick to that. And so that part, I definitely have always, step back, right? When you get too far in the weeds, you got to step back and say, what is our goal? What am I really trying to accomplish here? In some ways, don't sweat that, what you might think is so big is really the small stuff. So that was, a big lesson that I've carried with me everywhere else. Glenn Dubin at Highbridge also was fantastic because he was the one who pushed me and told me, to take risks. He was the one who said, stop trying to be your, IR and marketing and general counsel and CAO, because it's sort of what I was doing when I was a Lightyear. And he was like, focus on marketing, focus on one thing and, take that risk. And I did. And of course, I've been just marketing now for a really long time, fundraising and capital development. And it was thanks to Glenn, who was like, take that risk, be a little bit uncomfortable. It'll force you to be really good at it. And if you're not, you learn something, no harm, no foul, and you can go back to doing something different. So I thought that was really great. And then at Perella, my partners there, I had a lot of great sponsors there, but they really taught me the importance of being strategic. I knew how to raise money. I knew the process, but I also hadn't developed the piece of stepping back to figure out where am I going forward and what's the strategic element, right? I think that that's all really important things to know. On the personal front, I would never have been able to do what I've done or continue to do what I've done without a very strong female support system of other female friends who are also in the industry. And unfortunately, it's just something I learned later in life. And I'm so thankful for my girlfriends who do what we do. And, we're in the trenches together at different firms, but comparing notes. And, there are folks who don't like to share, and we are very much of the sharing one, and you support one another. And then, of course, I have a fantastic husband who used to be in the industry and therefore has always been able to understand the work-life challenges of this career. And so he's been fantastic. So it's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, but I think what your list shows is just how incredibly energizing our industry can be because of the quality of some of the people in it. And you seem to have been particularly lucky to not only have worked with some of these people, but have had them take an interest in you. And probably I may have only been minutes out of their day that they took to give you this advice, but clearly it was the right kind of advice. So I think you probably are. You're probably one of the lucky ones to have had that,
Right.
which is fantastic. And it's also very affirming to hear about the network you have with your other female colleagues in the industry or just peers, because that's not something I hear very often. Funny enough, in other industries such as tech in Israel, where we've done a podcast series, I do hear that, but I haven't heard it as much in finance. So I'm very happy to hear that too. You've given us lots of great bits of advice there through some of the key people. Is there any creed or motto that you live by yourself?
So I get asked that question often. My answer changes depending on the moment. But if I were to be true to myself, right, and think about what is the creed or motto that I live by? I mean, look, I've mentioned this already. I'm an optimistic person. I always am and have been. Even when I'm on the phone, this isn't the motto or creed, but it should give you a sense of what I'm like. One of the things that I shared with another marketer who was like, how do you market on the phone, right? Like, how do you create any impact? And I said, well, one thing I always do, and I learned this actually from a girlfriend of mine who was a software salesperson in the 90s. She was really good at what she does. And she's like, smile. I said, what do you mean? I always smile. She's like, no, on the phone. I said, but they can't see me. She's like, no, smile. It comes through. And so that's one of the things that I've always like, okay, whatever attitude you want to exude, whatever you want to do, you have to sort of exude that positive optimism or the smile. So I do smile, when I'm on the phone, right? Or I'm not on video, I smile. Hopefully you can hear it. But that also goes to some of the other things I would say, which is, and this is the creed that I really do live by. It is always, how can I help you? And that was, I mentioned earlier when I was younger and working in my dad's, stores or with my mom or with my brother, it was always, the customer is always right. Now the customer isn't always right, but if you have that mentality, it will allow you to get to know the person you're dealing with, be more empathetic to them. It requires you to listen and to understand, but it really is, how can I help you? Very often you see in our industry the opposite, which is what have you done for me lately, right? Or what can you do for me? And the reality is I don't live that way. I live by how can I help you? Because then, by the way, if I can help you and be of service to you, maybe, you might return it, but if you don't, that's okay too. I do believe in good karma, right? So, but that definitely, I would say, is something that I live by. I also, I can't believe that, we've been saying this, but, as a senior woman, to have air quotes, one thing I didn't realize earlier in my career was that what we do has an impact on the newer generation. And I actually remembered, this is some advice I got from from Tracy Stewart, who's at Corbin. She's the president there. We worked together when it was Highbridge. And when I was going to Perella Weinberg, I was 5 months pregnant. And I was talking to her about like, they want me to set the maternity policy, but we're a startup. I think you can only take 1 month off. And she was like, no, Susan, you are now a role model. You are one of the few senior women there. You're a partner. You have to set the stage for folks. You have to set for a younger generation, other women who will come after you, who will be pregnant. If you're setting this and you do the opposite, which is I'm going to be, guns blazing. I'm, very committed to my job. I'll take off a month max. She's like, don't do that. You actually owe it to other women to take off whatever the required policy. If it's 12 weeks, 3 months, you have to take it. Because if you don't, you will forever be the female senior woman who people talk about like, oh my God, she only took off, a few weeks. And so now I can only take off a few weeks, right? And so very often I think we forget as we get older and we're more senior in our careers. And you don't have to be a woman, even as a man. Whatever you're doing, you are perceived as a role model. And so it's important. You owe that to the younger generation and the younger professionals to do things the way you would have wanted it to get done. Now, it may go against your nature. Like my nature would have been to take 1 month off. That's what I did at Highbridge, right? But the reality is people are looking up to you. And so it's really important.
So my last question is around what advice you might have for your younger self. Is there anything that you know now that you wish you had known some years ago?
Sure. Actually, there's so much advice I could have given myself actually when I was younger, but we've talked about quite a number of them. I think the one that to me really hits home is to speak up, ask questions. I think it's important to have a seat at the table and to make your voice heard. When I was much younger, I didn't do that. And now I tell anyone who wants to know as a female, make sure you're sitting there. And when you sit at the table, be there. Don't just sit there. I did this one session and they're like, make sure you lean forward, right? We've all heard Sheryl Sandberg say that, but lean in, lean forward and ask the questions. Make your voice heard. That is going to be so critical for yourself. And so that's the advice I would have given myself actually is to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. You are such a role model, and not only in some of these learnings you've shared with us, but just in how much you pack into your career. So thank you so much for coming here and for sharing the concept of adaptive intelligence, which I think is an extremely insightful one, and for sharing your other insights with us.
Thank you. It was so fun to do this with you. Again, as I said earlier, so honored to be able to be on your, 50 Faces. So thank you. And just as I said earlier, keep up the good fight. We got to keep doing this all together. It's great.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.